I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, your co-host.
I'm Dean Detloff, your other co-host. We got to think of better titles at some point, but it's not going to be today.
Nope, not today at all. Maybe next time. That's kind of what I think every time we do an introduction. Hey, folks, this week we got something really good. We are talking with Keegan Osinski about her forthcoming book, Queering Wesley, Queering the Church. Listen, we talk a lot about Catholicism on this podcast, and that's fine, I guess. I don't know. But we're going to talk about John Wesley, and it's going to be the spiciest John Wesley takes you can imagine, and they're going to be great. You're going to love them. I think this is also this is our podcast episode that has the highest number of curses, and that's something to look forward to.
Mm-hmm. That is something to look forward to, and they're good curses. There are bad curses, that people do where it's like, you probably shouldn't have said it, but some people are good at cursing. Keegan's good at it. Matt, you're good at it. I don't think I make one curse in this whole episode because I don't feel, I'm not good at it. I'm not confident cussing, but I do think you two pull it off and get in. This one is rated M for mature.
Cool. I appreciate that affirmation about my swearing. I like that a lot. That's what I needed tonight. All right, let's go to Keegan and talk about this good book. This week on the show, we have Keegan Osinski talking about her new book that is forthcoming called Queering Wesley and Queering the Church. It's a real rad book. We got to read a little bit of it, and we're really excited to talk about it. So, Keegan, welcome to the show. Whenever we have an author on, we always ask them to give an elevator pitch for their work. So, would you mind giving us that elevator pitch for Queering Wesley? It can be a long elevator ride to the tippy top of the building if you want. So,
yeah,
just tell us what it's all about.
Sure. And thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about it. I'm excited for people to read it, excited to get it out there. Basically, I found that no one has been doing this kind of work, joining queer theory with Wesleyan theology. And so kind of it just fell into my lap. I was like, let's play around with this. And so basically I just take 10 sermons written by John Wesley, the kind of founder of Methodism, And I look at them with a queer lens. I bring queer theory and different queer hermeneutic lenses to bear on his work and on the scripture that he uses in his sermons, to kind of give a queer perspective to this work. And at the end of the day, the goal is to show that you can have a fairly robust and faithful Wesleyan theology that is, affirming and liberative for all kinds of people, all kinds of genders, sexualities. And it's not necessarily as, they're not strange bedfellows after all.
Yeah, well, I think you make a compelling pitch for sure, and it is really fun. I love the 10 sermon structure. It's such a cool way to read a book. I imagine probably a cool way to write a book too. So that is one of my favorite things about it. In addition to all the fun content, it's just organized in a cool way, and I appreciate that. Before we get too far into it, maybe you could outline some of the characters of the book, some of the big ideas. I'm the Catholic one, TM on this podcast. So I figure I should be the one to ask you, who is John Wesley? What's interesting about him? I think I had one Wesleyan friend in college who was very into Arminianism. So tell me what's going on here.
Yeah, so it's a funny question because I've had several people ask, like, so why are you so interested in Wesley? Like, what's so interesting about him? And I'm just like, nothing really. I'm not especially like, captivated by him. Although as I read his work, I mean, he's such a weird dude and super interesting as well, that I kind of just ended up, getting this like real affection toward him. But he was an Anglican priest in the 1700s. And his whole deal was he was interested in kind of taking the gospel out into the field. So he was a field preacher, and he came under tons of fire because back in the day in the Anglican Church, you were only supposed to preach inside a church building. And so that was kind of his fight, was he was trying to go out to the people, especially, he had a lot of connections with the working class, working people of England, that he was trying to meet their needs, help them, put food on their tables, help them, have healthcare, these kinds of things. And, bring that kind of like material gospel to them. And part of that, he was like, well, like, why don't we just go out into the fields where they are working and preach to them? And that was like this huge issue. And then he also spent some time in the colony of Georgia back in the day before the Revolutionary War, which he was actually against because he was such a monarchist, very just like loyal to the Anglican Church and the crown. But yeah, that's a little bit about Wesley. I've learned so many funny little tidbits and anecdotes about him. He wrote one of his better known works that's not necessarily religious is called Primitive Physic, and it is a medical work that actually was fairly in line with the medical literature of the day, but wedded with spiritual work and the Bible and stuff like that. But it was this is the kind of medicine to take for this kind of ailment and where you can get it and how you can make it and that kind of thing. So he was very interested in all kinds of things outside of just, the Bible. But it all kind of came back to, preaching the gospel to all kinds of people and making the gospel material and accessible.
Cool. That's a great introduction to John Wesley. Yeah, such an interesting person. A lot going on there for sure. I remember this one time. This is such a weird pull from my own memory. But one time, you actually did suggest this article to me on Twitter about John Wesley investing in this kind of like wacky medical device that like shocked people. A real cool 1800s kind of medicine. I love it.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, anyways, yeah, now that everyone knows who John Wesley is, and what he is about, maybe you can introduce the other big idea that comes from your book about queering. Queering has kind of like it's become one of those, I don't know, academic buzzwords sometimes, where if you go to a conference, you'll see 100 presentations about queering X, Y, or Z thing. But just the same, your book actually gives some very good theoretical background to what the word queering means, and I think a lot deeper sense as a mode of analysis. So, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's actually really funny. I mean, I've been having a lot of conversations about the book. We'll probably get into some of the drama about it later. But it's so funny, like, because I live in this like academic bubble, basically, I work in a university library. And yeah, queering is just kind of like, it's kind of passe. Like, if you're like, oh, yeah, wow, you're applying queer theory to another discipline, woohoo, big deal. But for a lot of people out in the world, like queer theory is very new. They haven't heard of it. The word queer is really triggering and kind of provocative. And so it's very funny. I feel like I kind of have whiplash because I'm like going back and forth between like people who are like queering Wesley, like big deal, woohoo, and people who are like, oh my God, queer and Wesley in the same sentence. Like, how can you even do that? So like hearing that question about like, like, yeah, we already know about queering, like what's the big deal? It's just really funny to have those like that polarity. But basically how I define, I think on the very first page of the introduction, I want to be really clear with what I'm doing. So I define, queer as an adjective and also as a verb. So the idea of queer as an adjective being, anything that's really non-normative, particularly pertaining to gender and sexuality. I like to also point out like the political aspect of queerness. So it's not just like, oh, you're gay, like, you like people of the same gender. But there is like this political aspect of resisting these heteronormative patriarchal structures that we just know society, um, is formed by. And then as a verb, it really is about problematizing these normative narratives, again, especially regarding gender and sexuality, and kind of disrupting and interrogating the gender sexuality assumptions that are in a text, for example. So that's kind of what I'm doing. It's this, queer theory is, from literary theory. It's been around, for decades. But being able to apply it to different disciplines is still can still be rather, novel. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do with queering Wesley, like doing queer readings, literary theory wise, in this like religious register.
Yeah, it's cool to hear you talk about that. I think it works too, as a reader at least. I feel like I learned a lot from reading it, and you have a real knack for introducing other theorists or ideas without feeling like you're just like reading somebody's summary. So good job. You're an effective writer. Congrats. And I mean that.
Oh, thank you. That actually, I mean, that means a lot. I mean, I am, a librarian. I'm an educator. The main audience of the book, I say, is accessible academic. Like, it's definitely academic. I put a lot of research in there. There's, the bibliography is rather robust, if I do say so myself. But it's readable. We talked about the format. Like, it's 10 sermons. Each chapter is only, I don't know, maybe 20 pages long. There is like a through narrative, like an argument that flows throughout the entire work. But each chapter is kind of standalone. You can pick it up and put it down, and you're not going to miss anything.
Yeah, I love that about it as well. And I think you're right. You can pick it up and put it down. Or at least I find myself doing that. And I love books that work that way. It's a good writing technology. All right, so we've got some stuff about Wesley on the table and some stuff about what it means to queer in general on the table. So let's put them together like your book does. You're really playful with Wesley and the Bible, and you draw out a lot of insightful points. And like you said, this kind of provocation about how we think about gender and sexuality in Christianity, and it's neat to kind of mash all those things together. Can you tell us a little bit about that deconstructive aspect of the book, or how maybe you're reading with and against Wesley at the same time, and kind of letting all this stuff stir together in the big stew that is your book at the end?
Yeah, so queer theory, just like feminist theory, and the function of queer feminist reading is a deconstructive methodology. So basically you're taking the text and you are finding the little cracks and holes that are in there. You're asking it questions. You're kind of just like poking and prodding and squishing it around. Yeah, you're right. It is very playful. I feel like a lot of people in theology especially are kind of afraid to play. I mean, there are a lot of kind of these rules of orthodoxy that people feel bound by for various reasons. But I'm not particularly interested in that. I'm more interested in that kind of more creative playfulness, and just kind of asking like why and why not, and like just kind of fucking around with it. And so that's kind of what I did. I mean, another question I get asked a lot is like how I even chose the sermons that I chose. And I really wanted a really like structured and good answer methodology for that, but I just honestly don't have one. And this is, I mean, it goes for writing, and the reading of each chapter too. It just kind of happened. I just kind of read the sermons over and over until I found these little twinges and like things that just like caught my eye. And I was like, I wonder what I could do with this, or I wonder what happens if I take this and go this way with it. So it really was just a lot of like playing around and trying different things, and seeing what came out of it, and applying other thinkers and resources, to kind of just see what could be generated out of this. Because again, like the end goal is really to continue a Wesleyan theology, the Wesleyan tradition as this like continuing stream. And it's always growing and changing still. So I was just curious to see how we could grow it and how we could play with it, and see what comes out of it.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, one place where you do that, where I was really engaged, I think, is when in your book, I think this is like in the first chapter, you start talking about the phrase born again and doing some of this like interesting, reading with, reading against kind of deconstructive work.
Mhm,
In Wesleyan denominations, and I think maybe just in evangelicalism at large, there's a really big emphasis on this phrase about being born again. And yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. I think to say the very least.
mhm.
As a person who was formed in that type of theological background, the born again language is actually kind of triggering, if not
Sure,
a
sure, yeah,
definitely like a bad reminder of how toxic and manipulative I think the church can be.
sure.
Um, I think the thing that comes to my mind immediately is like like Thursday night church camp, and you have to go to the altar or whatever. But anyway, something I appreciate about your book is that it finds a way to rethink being born again in a way that actually sounds pretty okay. Um, so on being born again, you write this: one must come out embracing the fullness of themselves and reclaiming the moral image of God in their lives, which is the image of perfect love that casts out fear. You also have some really interesting, I don't know, comparisons that you're kind of importing from other queer theorists about being born again and the idea of coming out. And really grasped by all of this. And I think it's a really cool way to reinterpret something that I've only experienced as very bad. So, I don't know. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got something good out of something that I found to be so bad within Christianity? How did you do it?
Yeah, so that's the chapter on the sermon, The New Birth. And yeah, it just really felt like being born again could just map really easily onto this idea of coming out. And, part of being born again is this idea of repentance and humility. And I just started thinking about repentance and humility as this idea of um, self-reflection, right? So in the typical like evangelical sense of repentance, right, you're thinking about all the bad things that you've done, all the sins you've committed, and saying you're sorry. But I thought, what if repentance was you still have that piece where you have that self-reflection of what have I done? How have I neglected myself or God's gift of my identity or my experiences? Thinking about sin as this like negligence toward the self or something like this. And then the new birth being this claiming of your identity or your life in a new light, in a more true and loving light. Because that's another thing about the queer experience is your truth or your authentic self or whatever you want to call it is seen as the bad guy or the bad thing that you're supposed to be rid of. But if you think about it instead as that exact new life that you're supposed to be born into. And I feel like a lot of queer folks might resonate with that, right? Like once you finally come out to yourself even or to others, you can embrace this new life, this new birth of a self that is really liberating and liberated from this past of sin, which was, repression, right? And so it's just, it really is just a rethinking. I think also in that chapter, it talks about the story of Nicodemus, right? Coming to chat with Jesus at night. And how, I think I make the connection of like cruising, right? This like gay hanging out, seeing who's around, like what's up, like let's head over back here, that kind of thing. Of like Nicodemus like showing up with Jesus, like, hey man, what's going on? And then the idea of Jesus telling him you have to be born again, and Nicodemus being like, how am I supposed to enter again into my mother's womb? And Jesus is like, oh no, you have to be born from above. And it's like this whole thing about being born from the womb of his father. There's just so much queerness there. And just like just being free to read it that way and to be like, what the fuck? Like, this is queer. This is not normal. It's just so interesting. And I think really what I want to encourage my readers to do, like I felt I was able to do, is just to really like read this stuff and feel free to like be weirded out by it in a good way. Because it is really freeing and fascinating and interesting. And it really, brings a freshness to the text, both the Bible and Wesley.
I like that, the way you're talking about it, especially as a way of kind of re-encountering these different stories and narratives and maybe allowing them to appear differently or appear in all their weirdness. That's really fun. And also a good reason maybe to go back and reread some of that stuff. I'll be curious to hear maybe a little bit more. We can ask you in a minute about that strange kind of dialectic between being like very faithful to the tradition and the text and also in order to do that, doing some weird stuff or things that other people might not think is faithful. But before we get there though, maybe, okay, you go through a lot of Wesley's ideas and sermons. You said, these sermons kind of suggested themselves, or you just sort of stumbled upon them. But what's one sermon that sticks out to you in particular? What would you want maybe more people in this tradition to know about Wesley and his theology? So as you were kind of writing the book, maybe what was the most fun chapter to write, and what do you sort of hope people will get out of the Wesleyan tradition after passing through some of the methods that you're proposing?
Yeah, so I think what was really surprising to me was I kind of came to it expecting, like, okay, this is John Wesley. He is the Methodist. Like, he's very kind of strict, disciplined, methodical, obviously. He had this, he was very just like, this is how you live your life. You wake up at 5 a.m., you eat your, one cracker for breakfast. Like, and so I was just kind of expecting it to be very, puritanical in that way. And he was influenced by these German Puritans, the Moravians. Like, he had this whole, early colonial kind of mindset. And obviously in that sense, he's not without his faults, but I was so surprised by just how open he was. So I think the chapter that I'm thinking about mostly is the one, I think it's between either On Charity and Of the Church. So in both of these, he's so open to the idea of difference. So in Of the Church, I think, is the one that I kind of go through, and I use Laurel Schneider's ideas about the logic of the one and the tyranny of the one, because the text that he uses is the one that's like, one God, one faith, one baptism, and all that. And I kind of go through and deconstruct each of those to show that this idea of unity is, false down to its core. Like, any unity is not just one. God is not just one. This one faith, this one baptism has, each one of those things has its own diversity within it already. And it just kind of, obviously, like, I applied that onto there, but it's there in Wesley's actual work. He talks about the differences between, say, Protestants and Catholics, and there's a lot of animosity there in his time. But he's very clear that he's like, I don't fucking know. Like, there's, like, the Catholics, like, they're kind of nuts, but whatever. Like, so are the Protestants. So, like, we can't really speak to it. And there's room for all of us. He's very clear, like, he has, huge disagreements with Calvinists, but at the end of the day, he's like, I'm pretty sure I'm right, but whatever, we're all Christians, that kind of thing. It's a very open and hospitable theology. And that's one of the reasons that I feel like I can do this work and remain in this tradition, because at, the core, the foundation of it is very open and very, there's space for all kinds of thought and all kinds of practice, because at the end of the day, it's all about love. John Wesley, his main thing is holiness, of course, but holiness is perfect love of God and neighbor. It's all about love and care for others, both, in your heart or whatever, and also materially. So, like, at the end of the day, if love is what we're going for and that's what we're trying to do, like, yeah, of course, sign me up. Let's fucking do it.
Let's fucking do it, indeed. So, like Dean was mentioning a minute ago, right? Like, you found something really valuable in John Wesley, and you're finding some interesting ways to read it. Um, you know, and not only, I'm sorry, maybe I should even reframe that. Not only are you finding something valuable in John Wesley, but like you're actively a part of like the Wesleyan tradition. Like, you're
Mhm.
on Twitter, at least I know you're Nazarene. How great.
Mhm.
I guess it's really interesting about your book, though, is that not only are you finding things to agree with in John Wesley, but you're also finding ways to have like productive misreadings of John Wesley.
Mhm.
In the end of your book, you have this really cool take on theology that I think is really instructive. You write that the act of deliberately misreading your teachers in order to birth your own method and mode of thought is a standard and necessary part of the process of scholarship, including theology. Such a good word. It reminds me a lot in grad school. One of my mentors would always tell us not to stick too close to our bodyguards, right? You have to like kind of kind of kill them and
Mhm.
find something new
Mhm.
or whatever. So I don't know. Maybe talk about that a little bit. What's it like to deliberately misread your teachers in theology and still be like a part of the tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A big kind of source of, I don't know, inspiration, if that's the right word, um, that I took is Mildred Bang's Wine Coop. So she was a Nazarene theologian. Her book, A Theology of Love, was published in, I think, 1972, 76, in the 70s. Um, and she also kind of met a lot of challenge with her work because she was kind of taking what had been traditionally the understanding of holiness, Wesleyan holiness. You'll still see it today, maybe called like something like American holiness, which is this much more strict legalistic way of thinking of holiness as, you know, purity or something like this, rather than love, which was kind of her. This is her influence, you know, is that this idea of holiness as love first and foremost, and that's how she read Wesley. And she says, and I have a bit about this in the introduction, I think, um, that for her, she needed to do a certain amount of translating work to make Wesley useful and relevant and applicable to the present day. She's very straightforward about that. And I was just, you know, reading her work and reading Wesley and being like, yeah, and we need to do that again because the 70s were also a long time ago. So we need to even take her and do that again further, do this additional translating work. And so, of course, I mean, so like yesterday was Wesley's 318th birthday. I mean, that's a fucking long time ago that he was around. And, you know, the same way that we read the Bible, I mean, it's a whole different time. So we, you know, even the most literal readers of the Bible have to do some translating type work. I mean, literally translating work when it comes to the Bible, to actually even make it useful. And so I think this idea of tradition again comes up where it's a stream, it's a river. I use this kind of metaphor a lot because it's happening now. It's going through the present and into the future, and we are in this stream. Um, and we can also like change the direction of the stream. That doesn't make it not the stream. It's still the same stream. It just moves and changes over time. And so I think in order to make it useful and life-giving today, if that's what people want to do, if we want to consider the Bible as scripture, if we want to consider John Wesley as a generative, you know, piece of our tradition, a useful text for our tradition, it has to continue to speak to us. And it can only do that if we continue to translate it for ourselves. Um, and so, yeah, of course, we're going to like lose some things. You know, how many people in the last couple of weeks have talked about how I'm making John Wesley roll over in his grave? Like, fine, whatever. He's dead. Who the fuck cares? Like, that's fine. Honestly, well, I go back and forth about whether he would be fine with what I'm doing. Because he's like, yeah, whatever. It's 300 years later. Like, obviously, you're going to do something. Or if he would be pissed about it. But either way, it's like, he's dead. So, but obviously, I still think he's useful for the tradition. Like, that's how a tradition works. But it's completely a foolish errand to try to make this backwards, you know, timeline work into the future.
It's a really good point though, because I think people think of tradition as like the antithesis of progress or something. Like they think of these things as opposite. And I
No.
mean, the way you're putting it is exactly right. Tradition is not mean being stuck in the past. It means like progressing in a really particular way. And I think what you've done is doing just that, right? You he found these ideas in Wesley that are kind of like the underlying logic of a lot of his, his sermons and his theology, and like you're taking it and running with it, and I think that's really, really fascinating. And the reactions obviously are something else.
Yeah, well, maybe you can talk to us about that a bit, Keegan. I imagine in my mind, but also just by having seen some of your Twitter and Facebook conversations, that not everybody is as excited about this project as you are. And I am not, I've never been part of the Nazarene Church, but I know a few people who have. And
Me.
yes,
It's me.
like Matt. That's one of them. My guess is queering Wesley is not welcomed with open arms in every corner of that denomination. So you've been sharing some boomer Facebook posts complaining about you, calling you a dangerous person. I don't know. Maybe that feels cool. Maybe not. Maybe both. What response do you expect to get from that book, and how do you deal with that as a person who is like actively trying to participate in that tradition?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a little bit of both. Like, on the one hand, it's like, this is hilarious. I posted literally just the cover. That's all I've posted the cover of the book. And people freaked out again, just because the word queer is next to the word Wesley. And they think, I want to say, like, one of the posts was like, oh, the LGBT is taking over or infiltrating or something like this. And it's frustrating on one hand, because obviously they haven't even read the book. They probably never will. And also, I'm not writing it for them. It's not a polemic. It's not an apologetic kind of book. I'm not interested in those kinds of conversations at this point. So on the one hand, yeah, like all of these comments and posts and, podcasts or whatever that they're putting out about me, I do not care. I care in the sense that it's funny, and like every time they post something about it, there are people in their audiences and their circles that actually need to hear what I'm trying to say, this like more liberative word. So I hope it gets to them, even through these like hateful people. But at the end of the day, like, I don't actually care what they think about me, and they can't do anything to me. So I'm not afraid of them or worried about them. I don't lose any sleep over it. I do spend probably too long just like scrolling and like laughing at all the comments, but never responding, because like it's not worth it. I'm not here to fight. So that's really interesting, but I do think it's worthy and worthwhile work. I think it is actually like constructive and useful. And I think there are people that do have ears to hear that. There's plenty of people who don't, but there's plenty of people who do, and there's plenty of people who need to hear it. And every time, I've been working on this book for, gosh, I guess like 4 years now. I mean, I've presented bits and pieces of it at different conferences, and I had the opportunity to go to my alma mater, which is a Nazarene school, and give a short version of one of the chapters. And in the audience, when I gave that paper, there were some, higher up, like Nazarene mucky mucks, like, administrators and stuff, who were like grumpy, like whatever. But afterwards, there was just like this horde of college students who were so hyped. And they were just like, we want to have these conversations. Everyone's afraid to talk about it. This is so great. Like, we need to hear this. I've been able to, like, over Zoom, like, go back to some of these like classes and these like campus groups to talk about my work. And like, that's who I'm doing this for, is like these young people who are coming up in the Nazarene Church, which is not affirming, or honestly, any Wesleyan denomination is not affirming, but who, care and love the church, and want to be a part of it. Being able to show them that, it's not impossible. Like, there is a place for you. Like, you can make this work. And, I wish the broader church would do that and, show that same kind of care to you. But obviously they're not going to. So it's my privilege and joy to do that.
Yeah, I can attest to and affirm that response from from younger people to your book. A long time ago, in the early days of your book, when you were just starting to write it, you did come and talk to this like small group that I was running at a Wesleyan school that
Oh,
I taught
that's
at.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And okay, so we were definitely the small group. The Bible study is what it was. What it was
Mhm.
technically. We were definitely the black
Mhm.
sheep of the university,
Mhm.
and it was like all the people that did not really want to do a Bible study. But
Mhm.
after you came
Love
and you
it.
talked about it, they were really energized about it. They were really excited. So I mean, there are definitely people who I think for this for there are definitely people for whom this work is like very important. So I think it's really
Mhm.
good.
Mhm. Mhm.
Despite the haters, it's great.
Yeah.
Well, maybe on all of that, I mean, something that's really interesting is that, well, there's like, I think there's almost like a tradition of theologians at this point who, come to challenge their own traditions in really, I think, healthy ways. But get this kind of pushback and have this sort of experience where some people don't appreciate it. Maybe like the people who are
Mhm.
the institutional gatekeepers, they don't appreciate it or whatever.
Sure.
And the question always comes down to like, well, like why stay in those traditions? Why stay in those
Mhm.
communities if you don't see yourself really accepted in them? So I don't know how do you see that working out for you? Like, what's your role in your own tradition and community? Why choose to stay despite the haters?
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic question. It's one I deal with all the time. And I have what I think is a fairly unique experience with the Church of the Nazarene because I did not grow up religious, never heard of the Church of the Nazarene until I went to college. Um, and my experience of church before that was an even more conservative tradition. I mean, it was a non-denominational kind of thing, but it was, John Piper, John MacArthur, complementarianism, that whole kind of world. And so when I went to Nazarene school and I started studying theology, everyone was like super, encouraging. I was told always like I was capable, I was smart, I belonged there, like my insights were valuable, like these kinds of things that in the church that I was in, in high school were like, no, you're a woman, you shouldn't be studying theology in the first place. You should be getting ready to have a bunch of babies. Um, and so when all of those kinds of relationships fell apart in my life, what I had left was the Church of the Nazarene and the professors and the colleagues that I had there who were, always like more than loving to me. And so that's kind of where I fell in with the Nazarenes and was like, great, I love this. Like, I belong here. These are my people. Like, I feel comfortable here. I'm welcomed. And then as I, got more involved in the church, I realized like, oh, like the whole church is not like, the university in Southern California. It's a very different context with like, say, like Ohio Nazarenes or, Southern Nazarenes, which is where I am now in Nashville. And so like realizing like, oh, this is actually quite a conservative denomination. I didn't even know because I had been so surrounded by more welcoming, loving people. And so I've just, you know, by luck, by whatever, by being #blessed, like I have been just with people who have encouraged me and loved me who are Nazarenes. And so I just feel like this is my family. And like, sorry about it. Like, you didn't really choose me. I didn't really choose you, but now you're stuck with me. You raised me, you educated me. I wouldn't be who I am today if it weren't for the Church of the Nazarene. And so I feel this kind of, I don't know if loyalty, I need to figure out a better word than loyalty, but a kind of obligation, a kind of connection to this denomination because it really has raised me. It has been a home for me because of the people, right? So obviously, there's so much of it that is not a good home for me. But it just is what it is. These are my people. Um, so while people would like for me to leave, which is really funny, right? Like it's an evangelical denomination, so you'd think they would be all about like trying to like win souls, but they're like literally trying to be like, can you leave? um, but I just haven't had the kind of negative, harmful, abusive situation with the church that a lot of people have. So I mean, obviously that is my privilege, and the actual interpersonal relationships I have with my own church, that I go to every Sunday, or the professors that I have who are still friends and colleagues today. These are all really positive, life-giving relationships for me. So I don't have a real reason to leave that, as much as randos on the internet would like me to.
Yeah, I mean, it feels sort of in the spirit of Wesley as you're talking about it, at least as you described it earlier, right? This guy who's out in the fields doing the preaching thing because he's like, well, that's just what you're supposed to do, I guess. And, doing that because he's a pietist, really, not because he's a, I don't know, wild iconoclast or some kind of person who's just trying to get out, but someone who's like, I want to double down on the commitments that I have and kind of follow them to their conclusions, even if that leads me out of the church or something. That's really cool.
Well, and it's so funny, right? Because yeah, they're like trying to convince me to like not go to church. Like, what is your goal here? Like, I am very invested in this church. I love this church. I literally go every Sunday. I teach Sunday school. Like, I do all these church things because I enjoy it. Is that bad? Like, I thought this is what you want people to do, and a lot of these people who are so angry are not even Nazarene. They've left the church because they thought it was too progressive, and now they're Southern Baptists. Like, I don't get it, truly. Like, obviously there's plenty of ways that I'm not a good Nazarene, but also like I am still a Nazarene. So I don't know what you want from me, man.
Yeah, well, it's such a good word. In such a weird way that all works out. I don't know. What do people want from you? Just trying to think about it. Well, one of the big themes of our podcast is recognizing that theology and Christianity are full of failures. um, Christianity is always trying to do something good. Well, not always, but it oftentimes is trying to do something good, but actually fucking it up in the end. So, in the closing paragraphs of your book, you say something kind of similar. You say that your work is a promiscuous effort of trial and error, of fooling around and fumbling in the dark together. And that way of thinking about theology really resonates with me. So I don't know. Would you say a little bit more about that approach, about trial and error as someone who's doing theology?
Yeah, I think really the only thing that keeps me engaged with theology proper anymore is the ability to play. Um, I mean, I've been studying theology, like, I mean, I guess you would say professionally or whatever, for, over a decade now. And I'm kind of bored of it in a lot of ways. Um, it's just not that interesting to me anymore. Um, and so being able to play and just like fuck around with it has been really fun, in a way that I hadn't really experienced since I was learning theology for the first time in undergrad. And so the bit about trial and error and just like messing around and like playing, like that's what this book is it is serious work, and it is researched, and a lot of work went into it, but at the end of the day, it really is just kind of goofing around. Um, and so I understand a lot of, if it doesn't resonate with people, or they think it's not appropriate or whatever, like that makes sense. And, I don't necessarily expect this to be for everyone. But I'm really interested in the idea of making theology fun and creative and joyful and life-giving, because otherwise it's just like fucking boring, and like I'm just not interested in it. And I think if you believe in a God, or like I just can't imagine a God that would be so fucking boring or limiting or limited. If you want to talk about God, like fucking God, uh, it's got to be like fun and playful and trial and error and just like messing around. Like what else would the creation story be? But God being like, hey, what if we did this?
Yeah, that's cool. I like it. I think too that way of understanding being a Christian at play, or being a theologian at play, or however you might want to put it, is probably hard to get. Well, it's hard to get my brain around because Christianity is sometimes too serious, too high in its own supply of moralism and so on. But I mean, I found that in the Catholic tradition as well. Like, the people I like the most are the people who are just willing to be like, yeah, I don't know, what if the Virgin Mary was also like a Marxist revolutionary? And we just kind of like thought about that for a second. And it seems like there's something really valuable and generative in just creating that permission too, for people to maybe do their own kind of playing around. How do you see that in your own work too? I mean, do you feel like maybe you're giving some kind of license for other Wesleyans to be like, as you said earlier, get weird with it, have the courage to kind of be weird and mess up if you have to, and just kind of see what shakes out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this again is really just one person's, read of these sermons, like one option. I mean, I think there's probably even a couple of footnotes in the book of like, I could have gone a different way with this, or, every time I wrote one, I was like, oh, I could go this way, I could go that way. Like, there's just so much material. I mean, this is how the Bible is too. Like, I just can't imagine why anyone would only want one read of it, because there's just so much opportunity. So yeah, I want people to take this and to like, disagree with my read and be like, actually, what if we think about it this way? And not in a way that's like, you're wrong and I'm right, but just like, okay, yeah, but what about this? Okay, yeah, but what about this? It's the same thing about like when you're a kid and you're playing pretend and you're like, okay, pretend that this is what's going on. And then it's like, a few minutes later, like, okay, let's like actually do this other thing instead. It's life's too short. There's too much fun shit going on in these stories. And that, that's what keeps me engaged again in like Christianity at all. Like, it's just so fucking weird. It's so fucking interesting. There's just so much there. And I hate the idea that like it would be limited to one thing. It's just not realistic. It's not interesting that way. So absolutely, I think people should be able to take your source material, take your raw material of your tradition, your teachers, your Bible, and play with it, and see what life-giving things can come out of it.
That's great. It's a good word. We appreciate it. Well, as we're wrapping up here, do you want to give a big plug for your book? Do you know when it will be out? Do you want to say something about it?
No. So the thing about my publisher, it's a pretty small publisher. It's coming out through Cascade, which is an imprint of Whippenstock. And so it should be out in the next week. I hope it should be out soon. And it should be available on the Whippenstock website, on Amazon. Fuck Jeff Bezos, but whatever. Capitalism.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll retweet it for sure. We'll make sure everyone knows about it. From our account.
I'm definitely, as soon as it drops, I'm letting everybody know, because I'm really excited to get it in people's hands.
Hell yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you should go buy Keegan's book. It's probably out now, or it's coming out in a few days. Who could say, whenever you're listening to this? But go get it, go buy it, pre-order it probably. You could do that. It's a good book. I said it's really fun to read, and I stand by it. It's very fun. You can also support our podcast at patreon.com/the Magnificast, and you can toss us a couple of bucks. If you do that, you can get into a cool Discord where we share some articles and have conversations with lots of cool folks. It's a great community of people there. I really like that a lot. We also do another podcast there behind the paywall called The Lock-In, where we make bad jokes about Christian subculture and talk about current events and whatever else is going on. You can find us on Twitter. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. Our music is by Amoria Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have